Right, so welcome everybody to our 16th webinar, where today myself and our master brewer, Mr. Carl Heron, are going to be talking about beer tasting. So we have got a lot to get through, so we will get straight into it. So let's see that okay, Carl?
Yep.
Yeah, okie dokie. So there's quite a bit with putting a taste panel together, and it's probably, beer tasting is probably one of the most fun parts of the process. It's the part I really enjoyed, but it's a little bit more than just having a drink, whereas drinks just basically being there with your mates, a bit unsolicited, no structure to it. Tasting's got quite a bit of rules to it, and it starts with the people. So Carl, if you're putting your flavour panel together, what is it you look for?
Yeah, a few things really. One of the key things is to try and get as many people as possible to want to come along, because obviously with business pressures, you can sometimes struggle. If you don't have a lot of people in your business, then you can actually get a public taste panel, and you need to be careful how you select those, but because they're tasting in process samples as well as final pack. But the key thing is to try and understand the taster's abilities, because we all have individual perceptions of flavour, and we need to know what people can taste, so both positive and negative, and also understand the thresholds that people have got. So when I first got trained, I was trained at Tennant's Brewery in Glasgow, and one of the things that Big Brian did were get us to do salt, sweet, bitter and sour first. So he actually shared how he prepared those samples with me, and I use those when I set up the panel down at Sharps when I work down there. And it's a good thing, because if people can't get those four basic tastes on their tongue, then they're unlikely to be great tasters. So it seems a bit unfair, that, because obviously everybody likes to have a beer, but as Mike says, it's a serious thing. You're looking for making consistent product at the end of the day. So it's about training people, testing people, and then getting as many people as possible to come along and try the beers, because then you've got a full spread of ability there.
Yeah, and the three taste of it for me is important. It's really hard on the one-man band brewers and the guys that don't have a lot. But from my personal experience, I've sent out, I think there was 6 tanker loads of beer, so each had 150 barrels in it. And there was a flavour taint in there that I couldn't pick up, and I was the only one to pass it out.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I always think about. You managed to get around that at Sharps, didn't you, by doing a public tasting?
Yep, indeed, and that worked well. So there were probably about 15 people in all that could come along, and generally we'd get 7 or 8 people. But generally down there we'd have like 40 different final pack beers to try. So that's far too many for, let's say, 3 tasters to try, because we'll probably cover this later, but your palate starts to kind of fatigue after a while, and you're not tasting things as well as you could. So what we tended to do there was like split that up between the 8 of us, and then we'd all come back to the table and talk about it afterwards. So yeah.
Super. Right, next one. Oh, there we go. So yeah, then it comes to the actual place where we're tasting. So like I say, it is a pretty serious point, and there's something that I always thought it was a pleasure to be, and an honour and a privilege to be sat on the taste panel, and whatever it was, took it quite seriously. What are we looking for?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's about the environment. So it's a good time. It's a good idea to taste it at a regular time, because your palate changes through the day. The theory tends to be sort of mid-morning is good. And we'll talk about what you need to do before you go to the tasting in a minute on the next slide. But mid-morning's good. There should be lots of clean, dry glasses ready to be filled with beer. And there should also be some nice, clean water that's flavourless. So bottled water is generally best. Stuff off the main can sometimes be a bit chlorine. It's a good idea to keep a register of 10s, because some people might only come in once every blue moon, and that's not ideal, because they're not going to be used to the beers that you're tasting. So the regular attenders are the best ones. People who I always got threatened at one point, in my career when I was on the panel with being kicked off because I just couldn't make it because I was busy doing other jobs at the time. So I had to kind of increase my attendance to stay on the panel. It's always a good idea to keep that in mind. The panel room itself needs to be quiet and clean, certainly no strong aromas, and you need to be able to see the beer too, because you will be looking at appearance, so that's important. And the other thing to keep in mind in terms of how you prepare the beers for the panel is to do them in a certain order. So if you want to do it, not everybody does it, but I think it's a very, very good thing to do because you catch things before you actually commit to brewing them, is taste things like the water that you're going to brew with, have a smell of the malts that you're going to be brewing with, particularly if it's a new batch, and also make some hop teas of any new batches of hops that are going to come through. Because all those will give you an indication of whether there's any issues before you actually commit to making a beer with it. Once you've done that, then get in to have a sort of glass of water, clear your palate if you've had a taste of anything, and then get into the final pack beers because they're going to have the more delicate flavours. You're going to really home in on what you want from those, and then finish off with any in-process samples that might be stuff at the end of fermentation that you're tasting to go on to the next stage. Might be stuff in maturation that's going to go to filter or into pack, and you're just making sure that you're happy that that can move to the next stage. You're not going to waste time packaging it if it's not right, or you might want to come up with a blend or something like that. And the other thing to just keep in mind is that you want to order them in degree of aroma, taste, and strength. So the least aroma, taste, and strength to begin with, obviously, and then building up to the bigger, stronger beers at the end, and then you're not going to fatigue your palate. So that's the best way to do it.
It might also be worthwhile just talking about time. I know you mentioned the other day that there are better time for tasting, but probably as well, we have got drink drive laws to worry about as well.
Indeed.
So, I mean, we used to always taste at around 10 o'clock in the morning. So you knew that by the time you come to driving later on that you were going to be okay. But I believe it's also one of the best times to taste.
Yeah, that seems to be theory. Certainly AB InBev breweries, because I work with them. Sorry, bad word. No, only joking. They taste at 10 o'clock everywhere in the world, wherever you are, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. And they do kind of order that we've talked about there. And that all gets recorded and so on. So, yeah.
So there are, we'll not go through the full slide, but it's important to remember that you as a person can really affect tasting as well. So this slide's there for later on, but basically we just want to leave it there to say that, to just point out that your actions, whether it's from aftershave to chewing gum to drinking coffee, can influence how the beer is basically scored. So do have a quick look at that. Have you got anything else to add on?
Very good reference point.
Yeah. Anything else to add on that, Cal?
No, not really. It pretty much covers everything. So I guess the key thing I will pick out, if anything, is the rest and cleanse your palate between beers. That's important. And just make sure that your palate's nice and fresh and ready to go. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but a good idea is to just have half a glass of beer before you start getting stuck into the actual tasting, because that calibrates your palate a bit. So we'll talk about that.
And mine would be not influencing anybody. So when you're tasting, keep it all nice and quiet. Don't go whatever. Just keep it nice and professional, and then talk about it once everybody's scored it. So why we flavour training? It is quite simply so you know what the product is, but it also helps you to dig a little bit deeper and to actually do some problem solving as well. So, Carl?
Yeah, very much the case, especially with, right across the spectrum of beers, in-process tasting and final pack tasting. If you trend that and you write things down, write the comments down, you will see something starting to develop as a bit of an issue fairly quickly. And then you can dig back into that particular brew, track it back to raw materials, track it back to the brew house and how it went through there, and quickly find out if there's something not going quite right. And at the end of the day, this is why people buy beer. They want to taste a fairly consistent product, and they want to make sure that it looks as it should. These are the two main things that people look for when they're buying beer. So it's fundamentally important that people taste their beers taste it through the process and make sure that it goes out as best as it possibly can.
Yeah, and being able to pick, even flavour positive, being able to pick up on those flavours and understanding how they're made and adjusting the process beforehand, whether it's for pitch rate, oxygen levels, mash temperature, or anything, having that knowledge of actually knowing what the flavour is that you're looking for allows you then to change things within the process again to drive that improvement.
Yeah, that's all very good. So, as it mentions on the slide there, you can actually get spikes of these kind of little tiny vials or capsules of these pure chemicals that create the flavors and the smells, be they positive or negative, and that's how you can train the panel. So we'll cover that in the next slide.
Super. So yeah, the actual flavor preparation, they the vials that Carl just mentioned are pretty much like what these are, the 2, the 9, and the 48 samples there, and you can get them basically for any flavor that you want that we're going to go through. There's literally loads of them, and then there's a couple of ways that you can distribute them. It's quite simple. Then you can either just flick the top of the cap, flake and crack it, and then distribute it into a litre sample, or use a micro pipette to individually spike bottles. But what's the best bottles to use, Cal, or the best beer?
Bud. Yeah, Bud is brewed. They take great lengths to make it as neutral as possible. So that's always a good base to use when you're spiking, because there's not going to be anything else there that's going to affect the spike itself. Yeah.
I've got a lot of time for how Budweiser produce the beer. It's phenomenal what they go through. But if you can't get hold of that, you don't want to spend the money, you've got some nice clean beer in tank, then just using that will also do a fairly decent job. Okay.
Yeah, it's a good idea, like it says in the last point in the slide there, about just having a control sample, so you know what that tastes like, and so you taste that, and then you're looking for the spikes.
Yeah.
Back in the day when I was doing the AB InBev panels, we were tested monthly. We got 7 spikes per test, and if you didn't get 4 or more, you were kicked off the panel. And also, there was a bit of a competition, to see who could do best. So it was always good to see how many you could get.
Yeah, there was always that with the last run training that we did. You had the kind of site manager that was basically, when he's going through the training, there was a few of them that was above me, and they were giving it all going through. And then when it actually came down to the exam, I aced it, and then they flunked it. So at least it was I'm at that.
Excellent. That's good.
It is quite fun. The banter's pretty fun.
It is, for sure.
Okie dokie. So then there is actually beer tasting, and there is a bit of a technique to it.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we looking for, Carl?
Yeah, I think initially, before you even get to sort of smelling and drinking anything, you want to have a look at the appearance. So we just mentioned this. You look at clarity. That might be important depending on what sort of beer you're tasting. If it's cask beer or filtered beer, you certainly want that to be as bright as possible. So you hold it up to a light. You might want to kind of get your glass and then put a pen behind it and see how clearly you can see the line. Yeah, so that's quite a good thing to do.
Yeah.
On the opposite end of that, you might be looking at haze. So if it's a hazy style beer, then you want that haze to be consistent, and you want it to be consistent right through the beer. You don't want to be seeing any sedimentation or anything like that. So that's something you need to keep an eye on. Colour's fundamentally important in beer. A lot of people drink with their eyes, and dedicated followers of a particular style of beer, one of your core beers, for example, will always expect it to be pretty bang on colour. And I've certainly come across situations where members of the public can get a half a degree EVC difference in a dark room in a pub. So people are definitely on it. So it's important that you try and get that as consistent as possible. And then finally, depending where you are in the country or in the world, there are different expectations on foam and head. So up north, it tends to be they like to have a good inch on top of the beer, and it needs to stay all the way down glass. Maltsters are very much judged by how well that foam stays on top and laces down the edge of the glass. These things are quite emotive, and it's a good idea to keep an eye on them. And if ever there are any issues or concerns, then you can always talk to us about how you can improve.
The great sparkler debate. When you are checking for appearance, when you do your final pass out, it is really important to pour a sample as the customer's going to see it. So if you're pouring your half glasses for your tasting, do pour a full pint and leave it on the side and just see what it looks like, how the foam dissipates once you've done your tasting. Just have a look and see what it's like from there. It's really important to see what the customer sees.
One of the things we used to do when I worked at Belhaven would do what were called trade tastings, which used to be quite interesting. So I'd jump on a minibus and go up to Edinburgh and like go around all the pubs that sold Belhaven beers and check their clarity and appearance. And I used to try and keep up with the production director and the head brewer in terms of pace, and failed miserably for the first few times until I realised that I could maybe do half pints, but they could do pints. It was just lethal, you know. But yeah, tasting in trade is quite important. At the end of the day, you're trusting people to serve your beer in a perfect way, and just getting out there and tasting beers where they're actually being served from cellars, through lines, and through pumps and fonts. That's quite important. So it's always worthwhile getting out there sometimes. And that one of the benefits of having a public panel, because they give you that kind of feedback.
Definitely, yeah. And then when we've had the appearance, it's time to get into it now, isn't it?
Indeed. So initially, you need to be taking a fairly gentle sniff of the beer. So it's about bringing the glass up to your nose. You have to swirl it to begin with, just gently sniff it. And then once you've done that, swirl it around. Try not to get all over your jeans. And then have a good sniff. Get your nose in there, as Mike's doing on this photograph, having a proper good go at that nice dark beer there. And these volatile aromas, things that trying to really get that out of there. It's a nice deep smell of the beer.
And then we come on to tasting, the fun part.
Indeed, which is the crux of the matter, the enjoyable bit for sure. So bring the beer up to your mouth, small sips, coat your palate, so right around your mouth and be the top of your mouth, and then have another sip and start to swallow the beer. Quite different to wine tasting when you spit it out. We have to swallow beer because we want to feel the body and the mouth feel of the beer. That is very much part of what the experience of drinking beer is. And then once you've swallowed it, if you try and breathe back out through your nose, because it's warmed it up as it's gone down your throat, you will actually get potentially some other aromas that aren't quite so volatile. So it's quite good to sort of try and do that and note down anything that you might get. And these things I always struggled with in terms of a negative attribute were metallic. And I was actually in Hungary at the time on a taste panel there, and they had a guy from a company called Flavour Active who would do all these spikes and things, and he would train the lab staff and the flavour panel on how to get these different attributes. And he got this particular beer that had been spiked with the metallic spike, and he kind of got his hand like this, and he just put the beer there. So he dipped his finger in his beer and he put it on there, and he smelt it. And I always struggled to get it in my mouth. Sometimes it's like a bit mouth coating. I think we'll talk about it later. But if you put it there on your hand and you smell it, it smells like metallic, and that's much easier to get for me. So we call it the perfume test, because that's what you do if you're testing perfume in boots or whatever. So there you go.
And these photographs that we've got were taken at the International Beer Awards, I think in 2019 it would have been. Do take the opportunity to taste with as many people as what you can. To be in the room full of international brewers tasting the same beer next to them was really, really good.
I mean, that is the epitome of the Brewing Awards for me, and it is very, very good, and it's really well structured.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so the flavour wheel, we won't spend too much time on that. It's there for you to have a look at your leisure, but basically really dialing into the flavour wheel allows you to really get in there and describe a beer and start tasting it for trueness to type. So we'll leave it there and we'll carry on.
Yep.
And then we're coming on to basically the start of what some of the flavours are within the beer. Now, me and Carl did have a quick chat about this beforehand, whether we put alkaline in for beer, but it is quite an important one. But the main thing is, if you do taste any of this or you do smell any of it, don't taste it, because it is potential caustic contamination and you're not going to do yourself any good. So the alkaline taste basically comes from a rising pH, which can come through dry hopping. Might get a little bit soapy flavour coming through it, and a little bit popcorny like we've got there, but most likely it's detergent contamination. So if you see any of the triggers there, the detergent like the caustic, popcorn, ashtray, then don't taste it. Go back, start checking pHs, maybe send it away for sodium analysis with your water, and then you'd be able to see if there's any extra sodium in there. For me, it's popcorn all day long. Carl?
I get biscuity.
Biscuity.
It seems to really bring out, and I think we cover biscuity later on at the end of the flavour attributes, but it does accentuate that. So to me, it smells really biscuity, and straight away, right, stick a pH probe in it and check it. And one of the things I used to do with guys at Sharps was just try and instill that, particularly if you've got an automated CIP set where you're cleaning something, you just press a button and you're relying on conductivity probes to control rinsing and that kind of thing. Twice I had to throw a whole fermenter away because they'd not checked the rinse liquor with a bit of litmus paper to make sure that it was neutral, or you can sort of take a taste sample. But it's fundamentally important that you try and make sure that the tank you're going into is clean, but also free of any detergent contamination. It should be rinsed. Yeah. If anything, just have a little bit of PAA in it. Yeah. And PAA, peracetic acid, is a terminal stellate that decomposes, so it doesn't taint me.
Yeah. So we've got there as well, just to make the point of the triggers that we talk about. Both me and Carl are slightly different for what we pick up. So don't worry if you don't get it the same as the person next to you when you're tasting. When you go through and you're tasting the beers, what you pick up for that particular flavour is your trigger attribute. So write it down and start taking it to taste with you, and then basically you'll have this nice big list of what all of these are and what your triggers are. Then if you pick up on it, you can go back and you can then help to describe it. So don't be afraid if you don't get any of them. You might get something else. Write it down and that's yours. So dimethyl sulfide comes from the malt. It's you can get it in some continental lagers, and the first thing that I always think about when it comes to DMS is Carlin. It's part of their positive flavour attributes. But other things that we talk about is like canned corn, canned tomatoes, and baked beans. Yourself, Carl?
Yeah, I would always kind of get sweet corn for myself. Yeah. That's why I pick it up.
It is a sweet corn, and where's it coming from?
It's essentially, it's like you say, it's from the malt, and it's a precursor in the malt, and then during brewing process in brew house, that's when it starts to form. It breaks down and makes DMS from SMM, and you can control your process in your brew house to either maintain it like they would do if they were brewing Carlin, or let it strip out. So it all depends on how you run your brew house, really.
Yeah. It's generally, if you want it there, a shorter boil and a longer stand, whirlpool stand, work cooling. If you don't want it, longer boil, shorter stand. That pretty much controls it. Isovaleric, my wife's favourite. So generally comes from old hops. If you put them at the start of the boil, you're probably going to get away with it because the boil will flash the volatiles off. But any older hops towards the back end of the boil and dry hopping, you can get isovaleric coming through. For me, it's sweaty feet all day long. It's particularly exactly my wife's sweaty feet. Good God, I hope she doesn't watch this. But Carl, and I have had this in beer as well. It's
I get the more the sort of Parmesan strong cheese kind of aroma on it.
Do like strong cheese though.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I have picked it up on hops and hop teas.
Yeah.
So
yes,
if you are buying hops that are maybe a couple of seasons old, and they might be attractive because they're cheap, just bang them in at the beginning of boil. Don't even think about putting them in as a late hop, and definitely not as a dry hop, because you will get this taint coming through.
Storage is pretty good around the breweries that I've seen, but yeah, try to, when you open them, seal them back up. I've seen people with it. You can buy the kind of resealers, can't you? heat sealers and then freeze them is probably the best I've seen.
Indeed, yeah, for stuff you don't use very often, definitely.
So papery, which is basically oxidized flavour, comes from basically any oxygen content in the beer, whether that's picked up at any point past fermentation through to packaging. It's going to have an effect on the beer. For me, I always get this most in pack beers as a stewed flavour. So it's kind of like a really bad one to get as a wallpaper flavour, but the thing that I can home in on packaged beers is like the stewed flavour.
I kind of go, to me, it comes out more as the kind of cardboard, the cardboard on the picture there.
Yeah.
I definitely get that. And interestingly, I've had it on cask beer.
Okay.
Cask beer generally, because it's got yeast in it, the yeast will metabolize and use that oxygen when it's doing its secondary fermentation in cask. But if you find that you're picking this up on cask beer at 4 weeks into shelf life, which is probably as long as it's going to last, then you might want to look at yeast counts, because your yeast counts might not be quite high enough to just get that, mop that oxygen up that's in there. Because obviously cask, you can't really have an inert atmosphere to fill into. Some cask fillers will actually have a little purge valve on them, which will purge the cask before it's filled. But more often than not, particularly if you're filling from a tank, you just fill it into an oxygen atmosphere. So having enough yeast there definitely makes sure that it's going to avoid that situation.
Good stuff. Diacetyl, the one that we all love. It's down as a bad flavour, but you do see it in certain pilsners. So Pilsner Urquell definitely has a little bit of diacetyl in there. Scottish beers generally have a little bit of diacetyl in there. Years and years ago, we was matching some Scottish beers, and we was getting quite clean beers with not much diacetyl in there, and we were scoring differently to the one that was going to mix because it had a bit of diacetyl in there. And it took a little bit of persuading that, do you want the diacetyl there or not? And it was a no, but it was always failing because it didn't taste like the one that it was trying to get to. So in some instances, it is something that you want in there. And I've said this a few times, but I actually think it works quite well with US-05 as well. I think the kind of sweetness helps it. And I get it from, but the thing that I get is when I first started working in the brewery, I was in the lab and we tested this via gas chromatography, and we had standards. And basically from opening the fridge, the whiff that I got there is just diacetyl all day long. So there are these others. It just doesn't bother for me. It's the diacetyl fridge and the standards that.
Yeah, that's what reminded me.
Got to get it out straight away. Yeah, same thing with it.
Yeah, I certainly get butterscotch, and they actually use this compound to flavour margarine.
Okay.
To actually make it smell like butter.
But
I think it can be reasonably pleasant in some ales, particularly darker ales.
Yeah.
But in kind of standard lagers, then it would be something that certainly I would taught that you had to check even before you crash cooled something to check for diacetyl as part of the kind of in-process tasting before you committed to cooling it. Because once the beer's cooled, it takes much, much longer for the yeast to reabsorb it. So yeast produces this at the beginning of fermentation, and then when it's mopped up all the easy to ferment sugars, it'll start reabsorbing diacetyl and metabolizing it. If you don't give it a chance to do that, then you can have that aroma coming through. And if you're looking for a nice, clean, crisp lager, then you probably don't want it there.
And heat helps to convert the diacetyl as well from its precursor. So a good thing to do at that point is if you heat it up to 60 degrees and give it an hour at 60, cool it back down, that'll actually, all the precursor that's in there will be encouraged to form as diacetyl. And then you've got a really good indication of what it's going to taste like. Especially important if you are pasteurising it. You're obviously going to heat it up at some point. You might think it's all fine and dandy in tank, but then suddenly it comes back after it's been warmed up and suddenly you've got diacetyl on it. It was probably there in the first place.
Yeah.
You just didn't notice because it hadn't formed. So
a good point there on the slide that you made, Mike, is if you get unusually high levels, then there might be a bit of a micro issue somewhere hiding away in the process. So it's then a matter of going through it with a fine tooth comb and tracking it down. So if you do get an unusual, all of a sudden, it's kind of very obvious, then start, having a look and seeing where you might find any bugs.
We're not really going into some of that exactly how it's formed in this at the minute time, but there are some decent blogs on the website that explain exactly what goes on within here. So if you are interested further, and rather than saying it's just formed by yeast, do look into that science a little bit more in the other blogs that we've got. Acetaldehyde, so green apple all day long, and generally comes from stressed fermentation. So it's made from yeast. One of the mainly we had a problem with this, and it was from under pitching. We was getting quite a bit of acetaldehyde forming, because we were under pitching too much, and we were trying to push the fermentation temperature a little bit high as well. So we got quite a lot of acetaldehyde forming off the back of that. But yeah, for me, green apples all day long.
Yes. Yeah, likewise. And I think, like you say, if you start high gravity brewing, which is likely for craft, you may need to sort of squeeze things a bit if you need more capacity, and then dial it afterwards. Then that's when yeast can start to get stressed and produce this compound.
Yeah.
Interestingly, probably the most technically advanced tasting room I've ever been in was at Beck's Brewery in Bremen, and they had this room that was like, it had a positive atmosphere. All the air was filtered. You sat in this little booth, and this hand came through and popped your beer in front of you in a dark glass. It was all very, very technical. Beck's does have a specification for acetaldehyde, so they actually want that as part of the profile, which I found fascinating, because I'd always been taught it were off flavour.
It is amazing how many flavours that are off, that we say are off, but they're actually a staple within a lot of the beers that we all know, whether we love them, and that's a different kettle of fish. But a lot of the beers that are out there all have what we call the off flavours there as their positive attributes.
Yeah.
Acetic, it's just full of vinegar for me. It's generally down to micro-infection.
Yep.
You see it a lot on cask beer ullages. So cask clean is obviously really important in keeping old casks away from fresh beer. You don't want any of that being in the air. But yeah, vinegar all day long, and generally poor hygiene.
That's it. I mean, I can't think of a beer where this would be a positive attribute, really. Even on a sour, you wouldn't really be looking for acetic. And as you say, I mean, Acetobacter is all around us, particularly if you've got a brewery that's kind of near fields and stuff like that. Orchards, it's everywhere. My biggest worry was always kind of cask ullage being close to cask filling.
Yeah.
De-ullage and clean away from the filling area, that definitely helps, because obviously when the cask goes out to the big bad world, it's sitting there in a cellar or in somebody's yard or whatever, it will encourage the growth of this stuff. Once you're going to clean that cask and get it hot and reuse it, this beer that comes back in it, keep that away from your filling area, and you're going to protect the beer.
And while the beer in tank may be zero in oxygen, as soon as we fill the cask, it's definitely not.
Indeed.
So, if there's anything there, they grow in aerobic conditions. So yeah, there's a good chance for them to spoil your beer.
I mean, Acetobacter and Acetobacteria are pretty small and pretty tough. So they take some getting rid of if they do end up in your process inside your brewery. So the more hygienic you can be, the better, and just make sure there's no dead legs and nooks and crannies where they can sit. Hoses that have got damaged, that's a classic, because okay, the outside might look damaged, it might be squashed by a fork truck or something, but the inside actually gets damaged, it delaminates. What happens is it kind of sits in between, so the caustic and the clean doesn't get it, because it's not getting that flow past those particular areas, and they start to build up, and all of a sudden you've got a problem. So, there you go. You get into other things.
Do you want to take this one?
Yeah. This is something I pick up quite quite a bit. I think I'm probably really sensitive to it. Sulfitic is another yeast stress thing. And it can also come down to poor hygiene as well. Some of the other spoilage bacteria can actually create sulfitic, but it's kind of that struck match thing. You can get it on cask beer that's not had quite long enough to mature as well. So it can come from yeast, obviously from yeast stress. It can also come from the fact that finings, be it isinglass or auxiliary finings, have sulfur dioxide put into them as a preservative. So when your beer's green and it's not kind of had that secondary fermentation in the cask, it can come off as a bit sulfitic. So it's good to understand how your beer, when it loses that particular trait, because if you're up against it and you've got people on phone and you've only got the beer you've just racked, make sure you say to them, well, yeah, you can have it, but make sure it sits there for 2 days before you tap it, and then it'll get rid of that sulfitic aroma. So, yeah.
Water can also, I'm assuming water makeup's always going to have a little bit of a say in this as well, if you've got quite a high sulfur level.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, they talk about Burton Snatch, and beers that are made in Burton and made with water from the wells in Burton will have more of a susceptibility to this particular taint because it's got high sulfate content in the water. So that the yeast does actually react with that. But given time, it will round off. And this is why it's important to make sure that you've given the cask sufficient time to mature. And then in the bar, in the cellar, you vent it. You use the soft spiles to just let that vent away and let it work a bit before you take it up to the bar.
Yeah. Butyric. So butyric is basically it's something you should never really get in the brewery. So I've got a story to tell about that one, obviously. So it basically comes from wort contamination. So old, stale, horrible worts, you'll get butyric flavours coming about. And the top photograph there is actually from the Lauterton, from one of the breweries I used to work in. We basically went from, one of the reasons I bring this up is we went from 44 brews a week down to about 4 brews a week, cut staff as we had to basically cut far too deep, and we didn't update the cleaning regime to suit the brewing what we were doing. And then a few weeks down the line, we started getting this milky flavour coming through, which I must say I could not pick up. I get butyric, but I couldn't get this. It seemed to come across at lower levels as this milky flavour that I couldn't pick up, and even an expert panel that get paid to taste was struggling to pick it up. Anyway, we started looking into it, and we figured out that we've got this butyric problem, and we started looking through the brew house, and we pulled up the plates. It's no mean feat of a job. It's a day job just to put them up, and another day to get them back down. And that's what we found. That was some horrible, that should be nice, shiny stainless steel. That was after a CIP, and that's what we actually got. So it's just something to raise that, we're in that same kind of situation now where everyone's had to really stop brewing. We're only brewing a tenth of what we were doing. Just do pay extra attention to any place where stale wort could form under the plates. Anything around wort recirculation, anything like that in your mash tun and copper, just have a good look at it. Comes across to me, baby sick, I've had kids. But like I said before, the guy that actually picked up on it, it's come across straight away as just a milky flavour. Same for you, Carl?
Yeah, baby sick.
Yeah, baby sick.
But look at that, 2.2 parts per billion. You don't need much of it to start making an effect.
Not a lot of it. But it's something that you very rarely see.
Yeah, I could probably sort of count on one hand times I've smelt it. And that's, when I've been judging and breweries doing lots of taste.
Yeah.
It's unusual, but it's not nice.
It happens. Chlorophenolic basically is going to come from a chlorine or chloramine, bromine contamination, which is either going to come from you cleaning your tanks with a chlorine solution. chlorine is great for making, basically getting stainless steel nice and shiny, but it can be quite corrosive to the stainless steel welds. So if you do need to use it at the levels that your manufacturer says and at the temperature that they say. But it also takes a lot more cleaning off and rinsing off than what normal caustic does. So really do give it extra flushes and make sure you smell it as well, and make sure that there's none of it left in the rinse water. Like we said with the caustic before. The other place where I've seen it is actually we found it in small pack, where the deaerated liquor was used, but it wasn't chlorine filtered, so it was Towns water that just went through a DAL plant, and a little bit of that just basically contaminated the whole batch. So do keep a close eye on anything where you just get Towns water past fermentation. Boil HLT and the brewing process will strip it right out. But anywhere where you get past any dilution past that point, just be really, really careful with this. And for me, it's TCP and plaster, same kind.
Likewise. I mean, as Mike says, if you do have to use a town main to create deaerated liquor, or if you're doing any sort of dilution post fermentation or post brew house, then you can use a carbon cartridge filter, or any sort of activated carbon filter will actually get rid of the chlorine or bromine taints, and those present themselves, depending on which compound, chlorine or bromine, present themselves in different ways. So you've got to be pretty much on it to make sure that you don't get those taints, because certainly with one beer that in a brewery that I worked at, we were kind of scratching our heads for the whole summer because the beer didn't taste right, and ultimately we found out it was some bromine compounds in the water that were completely within the kind of levels that the water authority were allowed to give us it at, but they created a taint and caused a nasty kind of astringent, lingering bitterness, and that was purely down to the fact that the water had too much of this stuff in it. So carbon filtered to sort that out.
Yeah, cool. Right, hydrogen sulfide. Again, produced during by yeast during fermentation. I get this as kind of rotten edge. You can kind of remember it straight away when you sell it. You get quite a lot of it at the beginning of fermentation.
Yeah.
If you've ever had the pleasure of working with open FEs, you kind of get it at that point. During fermentation, it will the movement and the stripping, releasing CO2 during fermentation will kind of strip away a lot of the hydrogen sulfides. But if you've not got your pitching rate and your oxygen rate and everything else sorted, you do risk picking it up, and it won't be mopped up later on in life.
I think lager yeast particularly produce a lot of H2S and sulfur compounds in the first 2 or 3 days of fermentation. I've had a few panic phone calls from some of my customers saying, "Oh, what's going on? I've had used wrong yeast, I've done something wrong." But it's just the fact that those yeast will produce that at the beginning, but like Mike says, the vigorous fermentation, when it gets going, it's like working its way through, it just kind of strips it out, and so it's not so much of an issue.
And sacrificial copper as well can help with some of these sulfur flavours as well. So if you do want to cheat a little bit, you can always add a little bit of copper, but that brings its own problems. Light struck. I'm completely blind to this. I don't get it. I remember being on a brewing course years ago, and we were asked to try a sample of Beck's from a bottle and a sample from a green bottle, a sample of Beck's from a can. To me, they tasted exactly the same. But if you want to know what light struck tastes like, quite literally, try the same beer from a green bottle and the same beer from a can, and it should become quite apparent to you. Mm. It's basically sunlight reacting with compounds within the hop, which basically bring out this skunky flavour. I must say I've never been able to describe that, but it brings out this skunky flavour, and it happens pretty much instantaneously as well. Even to the point, if you sat in the beer garden with your beer in the sun, that will still actually convert to skunky as well, or pick up
that really quickly. I think it's like you say, it's the blue end of the spectrum, almost ultraviolet.
Yeah.
That causes the reaction. But I find it difficult to describe. I mean, I've always seen it described as skunky, but I've never smelled a skunk, so I wouldn't know. But once you've smelt it, you'll know, and you don't need to go to any great lengths. As Mike says, buy a bottled ale in a flint glass bottle, a clear glass bottle, or maybe not Corona or some of the Mexican beers, because they use a different type of hop which avoids this particular issue. But that aroma that it's kind of, I would say it's in the sulphury part of the kind of tasting wheel. If you have a look at the taste wheel, that's what it'll be. And that's what you'll associate with. Once you've smelt that, you'll know what it is. And again, it's that fact we're saying it's a bad one, but in some beers and to some consumers, it's quite pleasant. They would expect it, and if it wasn't there, they'd have something to say. I've come up against this a couple of times when I've been doing consumer research with new beers in Central Europe, actually. And I put the new beers out against competitor beers after, I think they've been packaged for 2 weeks, and they were immediately put in cardboard boxes so that they didn't get any light on them at all. And they were done in a tasting room. And the beers that they bought to compare them with the competitor beers that come off a supermarket shelf. So they'd had exposure to light, and everybody preferred the competitor stuff because it had this stuff in it. So it were one of them things where people actually expected it in the beer.
Yeah.
To be careful with, but as a trained taster, you are trained that it could be an off flavor.
Yeah. And it is easy to produce a beer with without it if you wanted. If you, like you say, you can produce light stable beers just using modified hop products. So it is doable. We had my captain, have we? So yeah, my captain, again, another yeast, another sulphur flavour. Just dirty bins for me. It's generally down to poor yeast health. Normally autolysis. So basically, you've had your yeast on the tank a little bit too long. Anything else on that?
Yeah, I would agree. And I generally get sort of drainy, farmyard, that kind of thing. Aroma.
Pick this up quite a bit. It's a bit unpleasant. It is one that flashes off quite quickly for me.
Yeah.
But
I mean, obviously, autolysis brings all sorts of different flavour issues with it. It can start going a bit marmitey, a bit meaty if it stays on too long. But good practice is just get the yeast off as soon as you possibly can. Because that means that it's not going to break down and spill its guts into the beer and give you all sorts of flavour issues.
Yeah, Ian Burpack said he would add toast to the trigger for light struck as well.
I did notice that, and yeah, that is a good point. I've heard people describe it that in panels. Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Right, next, musty. Oh, musty. This is something you should never get in beer. So I've obviously got a good story for it. So generally, you get the musty flavour if it was generally come from corked wine, and where the kind of corks have got moist and mouldy, that then passes over into the beer. So wine, it just come across as kind of like just mouldy, horrible, damp place. So normally it was from corks. You could get it from malt that's been stored wrong and become damp and got mouldy in it. But the problem that we had was from filter powder. And we again, it actually comes back to the story that we started with, where I passed out all these tankers. We basically left some filter powder out in the rain overnight, and we thought it was okay to use. Well, whoever was on the filter thought it was okay to use, it wasn't me. And we carried on going with it, and it turns out that basically the wood had become wet, the pallet had become wet, that had soaked in through to the bags and into the filter powder. And then as the filter powder was used through the filter run, that mould flavour then came into the beer. Now, I didn't pick up on it, and the only way that we did actually find it was through going through and making solutions from everything that we had on site. So we did the malt And ultimately, when it came down to the filter powders, when we put it in hot water, warm water, suddenly you got that mouldy smell coming through. So it's really, it is a really good point to try and spend a little bit of attention on raw materials as they come on, and do check for things, and especially if you do think, oh, that's been stored mouldy, get the kettle, do a kettle test on it, put in some warm water and smell it. So have you ever come across that one, Carl?
No, I haven't actually.
I had to put it in.
Not even when I've been judging, it is quite an unusual one.
You should never get
one of those sort of unfortunate things. I mean, I've been in some breweries, not in this country, where there's very old cellars, and you tend to find at back of tanks where you don't keep up to stuff, mould. You get that black mould building up on walls. That can, I guess, make its way into the beer, through a hose that's been disconnected, been on the floor or whatever. So just out of good hygiene, really.
Yeah.
You've got to be careful. This might be the aroma, but you might have mycotoxins in there, which could make people ill. So you've got to be really careful with this particular type of thing. It's just out keeping things clean. Scrub walls down. Use a bit of hypochlorite, bit of bleach on the floors and the walls now and then, and you should be all right. So.
Yeah, definitely. So metallic. So you let's listen to my daughter sing over that. Metallic flavours, generally going to come from brewing liquor. Especially if you're taking it from the ground, you might have quite high levels of iron coming through. But you can also get it from rusty fittings. If you're using some ball valves on tanks, or some not quite hygienic stainless steel fittings on your tanks, they might actually bring across some nuts on your filter housing. I know I've seen
as well. I think in older breweries, and like you say, sometimes you can't always see the pipes that are supplying your water, but anywhere where there's mild steel, it's got the potential of picking up these ferrous ions.
Exactly.
And then that can obviously bring this taint quite quickly. So,
and we've also got we might add zinc sulfate to help fermentations, and also some yeast foods have copper addition in there as well, as we spoke about before with some of the sulfur flavours. So you put too much of that in as well, you can get these metallic flavours coming through. I get it just as blood. It's kind of like goes in, and it's you kind of just feel it coats your mouth straight away. You can't really get away from it. But Carl,
that's what I used to struggle with. So I had to do that. I got the copper coins when I did the perfume test. I couldn't get that kind of mouth thing in my mouth at all.
So quite literally, just dip your finger in it, put it around, rub it onto your hand, and give it a smell, and you'll just smell metal straight away. It'll remind you of copper coins. Okay. Phenolic. So phenolic flavours are all generally yeast produced. They come from a gene within the yeast called a PFOF gene. And it is very much desirable in some beers and not in the others. I must say I'm a big fan of it. I love phenolic flavours in beers when it should be there. And it's a lovely spice flavour for me.
It's that clovey kind of thing, isn't it? Which you would expect on wheat beers and that kind of thing. And I think some of the kind of mixed firm and saison stuff tends to kind of promote this as well.
Yeah.
But if it's one of those that kind of appears from nowhere, and it's not what you'd expect from the yeast that you're using, because obviously those beers I talked about have a specific yeast which has got the POF gene. Then you may well have a cross-contamination, or you might have some wild yeast in there, because most of the wild yeast, I think, do have the POF gene, don't they?
They do, yeah, that's correct. And once you've got wild yeast, it's really hard to get rid of it. It's a tough one to manage. It's pretty easy if you're just using dried yeast all the time, but if it goes into the yeast you're reusing, trying to clean that up quickly is a bit of a nightmare. And there's nothing you can do once it's in there. Acid washing doesn't get rid of it. So, yeah, if you do start to see some of that when you're tasting, you think, oh, that's a little bit phenolic, get on it straight away if it shouldn't be there, and get a new strain ordered straight away. Sour. Do you want to take this one, Carl?
Yep. Generally, this is something that you would purposefully put there if you were making this particular style of beer, and you can do that by adding lactic acid. We talked about acetic, and acetic's obviously going to reduce pH and give a sourness, but it's got that particular aroma of vinegar. This type of sour could come from lactic bacteria. So if you're making a sour beer, you will generally put a lactic culture in there to get that acidity. Whereas if it's not expected, then you would start looking for those particular types of bacteria which work anaerobically. You can also reduce pH by fruit addition. So that will have a lower pH generally, because they will have made it so that it's low pH, so it's preserved. And you can have various sort of effects on your palate. So sourness, you've got an actual sensors on your tongue that will pick up sour. So you get that acidic, it might be citrusy, lemony, whatever might remind you of that. But if it's a kind of milky sourness, or like a dry, lingering sourness, then that's probably the lactic. This is one I would definitely recommend if you're training a panel, because it's a funny one. It's a bit difficult to describe, but once you know what it is, and you've tasted it as a spike, you'll remember it forever. And it's very much one of the prevalent, like beer spoiling organisms you get in a brewery. So it's worth knowing what it tastes like and what it smells like.
All right, we've probably got time for one more. So we're coming on to a nice one, actually. One of your favourites, Carl. I'm going to let you completely take this one.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think is not just because I work with malt now, but I've always liked malty and malt forward beers, and smelling a malty biscuit on, I've spelled that wrong one, getting this on a beer to me with a nice balanced hop and a nice aroma coming through at the end, it's just perfect. So it's actually made in the kiln, is this particular compound, by melanoidin reactions, and it's literally what it is. And I've put a picture of a malted milk biscuit there, to kind of give you that picture. But yeah, if you get a Vienna or a Munich malt and just taste it as grains, be it crushed or whole, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. It's that malty biscuity depth. And the levels of it can be played about with by using these different sort of lightly toasted grains to get that in there. And I would say, this goes back to another presentation we did about recipes and creating recipes, is if you're looking for that, stay away from crystal malts, because that's a different kind of reaction. That's all about caramelization mainly. So this will give you colour, a malty biscuit, maybe slightly bready toasted bread, whereas crystal malts will give you more caramels, toffees, and that goes right into kind of dried fruits and all sorts of things. So yeah, it's a great thing to find in beer, but it depends on style. You probably won't want a lager with lots of malty biscuit in it.
So this is cranking the heat up on the malt in the kiln once already dried, rather than stewing.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, you'll get it on ale malts a little bit too, particularly things like Maris Otter. Maris Otter does tend to naturally have a more biscuity aroma than the more modern varieties. So it's just a matter of thinking about that when you put your recipes together, because it's a good attribute to have in certain styles.
So the next one that we're coming on to is personally one of my favourites, and I absolutely love a nice fruity little number. I do love loads of esters in beer. So isoamyl acetate, again, it's all from yeast in fermentation. You can mess about with this. You can basically you dictate to your fermentation how you want these things to be formed, but your yeast selection as well makes a big difference. Pear drops and bananas, I love it when it comes through as bananas, though. I really do.
Yeah.
Anything else on that, Carl?
No, I mean, probably one of the beers I find it most on is Heineken, and I think it's part of their profile. So if you get particularly draft Heineken, you can get the pear drop on it really, really clearly.
Yeah,
so that's a good place to find it. you know, if you're not going to buy the spikes. But like you say, it's a lovely ester. It certainly builds the profile and aroma of a beer.
Yeah.
And you can use your brewing process and particularly oxygenation to sort of promote it or take it back a bit, depending on what you want to do.
Yeah, yeast stress is basically what you want. You want to try and stress the yeast out a little bit, and you'll get lovely esters coming from that. But as well, if you do high gravity brew, you will get a lot more formed, especially when you dilute it back. So if you had like say for Heineken, for instance, I don't know what they do with Heineken, but if they brewed Heineken at 7% and then diluted back to 4% and then compared it to the 4% one, you would always get more esters in the high gravity brewed one because they just don't dilute 50-50. Also, vessel design has quite a big impact on this as well. The more CO2 during fermentation, the less esters there are, less chance of esters being produced. So large conical straight tanks, big heads, more hydrostatic pressure, more CO2 compared to the nice, good old-fashioned open squares, especially the Lancashire open squares. Yeah, so quite a lot you can do actually to mess about with esters. Do you want to touch on this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's another ester. The yeast's got some incredibly complex biochemical pathways to produce these things. But again, this is something that you probably find coming more from an ale strain. It's appley, more red apple than green apple. So we talked about apple when we talked about acetaldehyde. This is more red apple and like an aniseedy kind of aroma. So a pleasant one to have.
Yeah. Sorry, Carl. I struggle to pick this one up, I'll be honest with you. At quite high levels, I get the aniseed in beer, but I really struggle with this particular one. Yeah, I don't know if I just struggle with the differentiation between red and green, but yeah, I do struggle with it a little bit.
Yeah, I've been on a few panels where people struggle with that. Just a kind of richer, warmer kind of aroma than acetaldehyde would be.
Yeah.
Again, probably one of those that if you're going to buy a few spikes to train a panel, you might want this one. It's a good one to have in there.
Yeah. The same with some of the sulfurs. It's quite hard to differentiate some of the sulfurs as well. So it's good if you can, if you go through the initial training, you find that everyone's perfect on dash cell DMS, but they do struggle with the different sulfurs like H2S light struck. Next time you do the training, then really choose the right vials and dial in on that and get them to just get them better at differentiating the sulfurs. Again, it's something I did struggle with when they were all next to each other. Pick them out quite easily with when they were on their own, not next to another sulfur, but when they're all next to each other, it's quite hard to do.
Yeah, indeed.
So ethyl butyrate, do you want to take this one as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is a really, really pleasant ester in the kind of more modern New England type IPAs, and certain yeasts will actually produce more of this. The kind of East Coast types of yeast, and I think that new Verdant strain, I imagine that Lallemand are doing would probably have quite a bit of yeast there, this ester in it. So it's mainly tin pineapple is what I certainly get, but it can be perceived as a number of tropical fruits. I think there's a lychee sitting there on that picture, and that's a completely different. It might be either lychee or rambutan there. But that comes from a different sort of ester, but everything else you can just pick it up, and it's just a nice tropical fruit ester. So if you're going for those type of hops in your beer, and you want to promote that tropical fruit aroma, then trying to get this particular ester in there with the yeast choice that you've got, like Mike says, using the brewing process to promote and encourage yeast to produce this ester, can be a really pleasant thing.
So do you think that's more yeast selection over process changes?
Yeah.
It's lovely when you get it in there. It just really does bring out the hops. It's lovely. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this is something that you can go back to time and time again, and every time you come up to some kind of tasting, any taste training, just keep on using. If you've got any questions, then fire them away to us, and we'll do what we can to help you out. So thank you very much.
Yep. Thanks for listening, everyone.